Hi there, and welcome back to Blooming Slopes Gardens, my hillside haven nestled beside a busy port. Coming up in this episode, we'll be exploring a rather fundamental aspect of hillside gardening, terracing. You see, this slope, as lovely as it is now, was once quite unstable. We'll be discussing how we transformed it into the structured planted terraces that you see today. I'll delve into the choice of materials, and I'll share what I believe is the real secret to creating terracing that not only looks good but stands the test of time and weather. If that sounds like your cup of tea, or you're simply curious about the process, then do stay with me for this episode. When we bought this place back in 2021, the previous terracing had seen better days. It had all but rotted away, and the whole hillside was becoming very unstable. As you might imagine, as a gardener, I am much more passionate about the planting and the beautiful blooms than I am in garden landscaping and construction. However, the truth is, proper terracing was absolutely essential to create a safe environment for both plants and gardener alike. This footage was taken in May 22 and shows the terraces shortly after they were put in. Now let me share a glimpse of how things looked before we embarked on this project. These images were taken before the work began, and they really tell the story. You can see the old railway sleepers that were rotting away and failing to hold back the soil. The hillside was steadily and rather alarmingly eroding downwards. Not ideal for a garden, to say the least. And here's what the garden terracing looks like today in February 2025, beautifully settled into the landscape. In Irish gardens, terracing is typically built with either stone walls or treated wood. Railway sleepers are a common and cost-effective solution for wooden terracing due to their weight and availability. And they do last quite a long time, even though they eventually degrade. While the previous terracing used railway sleepers, we decided to go with treated wooden beams instead. Why? I hear you ask. Well, let me explain. Normally the landscape gardeners, the construction crew who actually build these terraces, would simply arrive with a mini digger and more or less bulldoze the garden. Digging trenches for the wooden beams, anchoring them in, the whole process would be done with machinery. And for the railway sleepers, it's easier to use machinery to maneuver them. They're heavy. Alas, in our case, that wasn't an option. The hillside garden you see does not have any vehicular access whatsoever. The only way in is from the lower gardens up some rather steep steps, which meant the entire project has to be done, dare I say it, the old-fashioned way. Every single beam has to be hand-carried up those steps from the lower garden and then manually wrestled into place. And that's why we decided to go with the lighter treated wooden beams over the heavier railway sleepers. While I am, admittedly, much more interested in the planting side of things as a gardener, this terracing project did teach me a great deal about garden landscaping and construction. There are 3 key aspects to the garden terrace construction we did here, and I think they're worth sharing. The first is a solid foundation. For each terrace, a trench needs to be dug out and the ground underneath levelled, for each of the wooden beams to sit into. Each beam needs to lie perfectly straight and flat within its prepared bed to ensure stability. Secondly, each wooden beam needs to be firmly anchored into the hillside. There are a number of approaches to achieve this, and we made use of a combination of 2 such approaches. Each beam is first attached to and anchored into the ground by a sturdy steel stake. In addition, the shape of the terrace acts as a further anchor. They are sort of like a squared-off C shape. The long front beams have these 2 connecting side pieces, which are then buried deep into the hillside, further anchoring the terraces in place. Lastly, and most importantly, and this I believe is the real secret to successful garden terracing, the terracing needs to be designed with drainage in mind, especially in rainy Ireland. For this terracing, a second trench was dug behind the foundation trench that the beams sit into, and a drainage pipe was laid along and behind each terrace. This piping makes an easy path for the water to flow along and away down the sides of the terrace garden, Without this, water will find its own path, and that can mean pushing the beams out of place over time. We've had a series of very heavy rainstorms this past winter, and as you can see here, some of the drainage pipes have been uncovered. In a way, this is a good sign. It suggests that they are doing their job well and diverting the rainwater. Mind you, covering this back up is now firmly on my to-do list. Now for a word of caution. The steepness of the slope does play a factor into whether this terracing technique is viable or not. Down in the lower garden, the slope is basically too steep for this approach. We tried terracing this small metre-wide section, but as you see, the soil has already fallen down and over it, almost burying it. A different approach will be needed for the lower gardens. And in fairness, even the bottom tier of the main terracing up here is probably borderline too steep. This is probably why the gravel keeps sliding down, uncovering the black weed-suppressing membrane underneath. Overall, the hillside garden terracing has held up well enough, and it has made the garden a lot easier and more enjoyable for this gardener to potter around in, not to mention safer. Well, that's it from Blooming Slopes Gardens for this week. As always, thanks for watching, especially if you made it this far. Do join me again next time. Until then, so long and happy gardening.